Press record. Welcome to everybody. I hope everyone's well. Thanks for spending your Saturday afternoon with us again. I want to start by making a couple announcements. The first is that I got an email from a comrade of Lazarus who is sort of her name is Claire Siboni. I don't know, Claire, are you with us right now? Can you hear me?
I can.
You're not Claire. That's Danny.
I am.
How are you? Hi.
I am fine. You're also Dan.
You look great. You look like you've been in quarantine for years, my friend.
I've had this face for years. Don't worry, everybody.
You look beautiful. Okay.
Oh, that's very sweet.
Yeah, we're going to be getting going here and doing some real work. I just want to start with a couple kind of things for the good of the whole. So Claire has reached out to Lazarus himself, who is being invited to join us for the May 30th session. Yeah, we're very stoked that Claire's been willing to do this. He is right now very much interested in the worker situation after the COVID crisis dissipates. And he's been, according to her, writing a lot of theoretical work about this in conjunction with the Yellow Vest movement in France. Apparently he's very enthusiastic about the Yellow Vests. So we hope to get him on the 30th. If not, we can provide questions that he could answer for us. Although obviously it would be much better to have him come, and then we'll need somebody that can translate. Claire has offered to do it, but if others are good with French to English, we might call upon you to help us. We can talk about that. So all of a sudden, the 30th event now appears much differently. I'm going to send out a sort of survey very quickly around what we call the 30th event, in part because we call it Socialists Think. And socialist is a term which is kind of highly experimental in a North American context, and I suppose elsewhere. But it's also the name of an article that Assad Haider wrote. And Assad's and I's vision was to kind of use this group as a way to sort of hone in on a very North American context in the problematic of this term, socialist. However, it dawns on Gabriel and myself that people think might be a more interesting title for the 30th event. It's slightly more amorphous, like what the fuck are you guys, what is this, people think it could be the title. So I want to get people's opinions on that and what your preference is. Okay, those are my only housekeeping. Now we're going to turn it over to Gabriel, who's our plus one, our facilitator. He's much better facilitator than most of us because he's bringing visuals to the conversation. And we are in very good hands with my very good friend, Gabriel. So please take the reins.
Thank you, Daniel. Well, guys, first of all, really honored to be here with you and to help guide us through these two chapters. If I knew what chapters I would be helping to coordinate the reading for in the book, I perhaps would have been a bit more cautious before accepting, because I think are by far the hardest and most dense ones. Most of the crucial concepts appear there, and I had a really hard time with this book the first time I read it, and now trying to kind of go through it again to prepare for today. That's why I decided to do something which I think might help, which is I separated. I don't have the English version with me, so I use my Brazilian and the French one. So I just selected from the English translation some passages that seem to be, let's say, the ones where apparently he's defining some of the concepts and going through some of the arguments, so that when we get into the discussions, we can actually go back to the text together and see if that works. But there is some, let's say, some selection, some subjective preferences that I had to do when selecting these passages. So some stuff might not be there that we actually need to focus on. I added the page numbers as well to make it helpful. And to pass the time and not to focus on the total social catastrophe here in Rio, I tried to also add some slides just with some kind of schematics that were helping me to get through some of the passages, but I didn't have time to go over all of the chapters. So it's just some schemas that I did with some of the ideas to try to make it clear for myself, in fact. And I thought that we could perhaps try to do some of these as well together as we go along, because I find it very hard, but also very rewarding to kind of extract a bit more of clarity from the book. I think that's something that is valid for Lazarus' work, also for Badiou's, though Badiou is definitely, I think, at least especially in his more recent work, much clearer and much more, and much less indebted to a sort of grammar and rhetorical device that is very dependent on you being intimate with the French theory scene, with the debates they were having with their main interlocutors. So I think especially since 2006, perhaps Logics of Worlds, it becomes easier to follow his writing without having that background. But Lazarus, for me, a bit like Lacan, for example, who is, for me, a particularly interesting point of comparison. I think a lot of the density of the text is also follows from the sort of particular context and conjuncture he was writing in, and who his interlocutors were, what battles he was facing, and he decided were the most important ones, not necessarily the same fronts of struggle for us today. For example, the situation of writings on socialism, political organization today, perhaps fighting for clarity and for accessibility might be a bit more point of privilege struggle today than it was back in his time, when making radical philosophers think twice could be a bit more important, and then that sort of ample transmissibility, I guess. So I wanted to preface then, before we begin, just some remarks that were helpful for me when engaging with this book, and I hope that it might. I read some of the notes that you guys wrote on the first session, and I saw that some people referenced similar backgrounds to mine. So perhaps these remarks are not so private or so singular. For me, three things were really helpful in clarifying a bit or understanding a bit Lazarus' work. The first was really having actual problems with political organization. I think that this is the sort of book that makes much more sense if you're facing problems for which it has something, about which it says something, like having a general understanding of it, having to accept at face value its conceptual structure, the terms it decides to use. All of this makes for much more complicated digestion of the text than if you have something exterior to it, like some problematic that you're facing in a militant organization and something like this, that allow us to cut the text in two and say, okay, this is his problem, this is what interests me. So this was very crucial for me, and we can talk about this as we go along. The second thing was that I had a sort of transversal problematic that really helped me to clarify the stakes of the book, which was a debate, kind of cross debate with Lacanian theory, not in the sense of interpreting Lazarus in a Lacanian sense, but realizing that there is a sort of critique of Lacan that I'm interested in that is very similar, I think, in some points to the ideas and approach that Lazarus brings to the table. He's writing in a context where, in terms of, let's say, content of theories, people are very aware of the singularity of political movements, singularity of subjectivity, singularity of text interpretations. But it doesn't mean just because you're aware of it and you're citing it in your texts that you are, in fact, let's say, dealing with it or reframing theory so that it accommodates that singularity. That's a problem for psychoanalysis because, for example, Lacan, I put at least 30% of his obscurity on that account. The fact that he has this problem. He wants to come up with a theory, like say, theoretically, there is a statement in his theory which says, you know, you should listen to your patients rather than look for a dictionary of what it is that what they say actually means. The meaning of what they're saying comes from their actual speech. But this sort of claim to listen to people rather than follow a manual, paradoxically is itself a manual. And just because you're using words like singularity, enjoyment, you know, speaking beings or whatever, doesn't mean you're actually listening to people. It's very easy to substitute actually engaging with people for terms that mean engagement. So it's a very complicated problem. And I think that a very French solution to this, meaning like 70s context, is to appeal to a sort of theoretical density, to a certain poetic language, to a certain torsion of certain terms and ways of speaking that make it hard to jump from the abstraction of theory to a sort of abstraction in practice. And you leave some room open because it's not easy to pass from one thing to the other. So Lacan would say something like, my texts are not meant to be read. And his very kind of obscure way. And being aware of that sort of problem that psychoanalysis faces, that has something to do with how do you engage more immanently with the thinking, I think helps when you come to the problems in anthropology of the name, right? It helps to, let's say, get a better assessment of the sort of problematic this guy is kind of buying into. He's telling us about, in theory, about, say, thinking immanently what is going on in a certain political process, but how do you write about that? What level of abstraction you need to assume to be able to refer to a process that is happening somewhere else without at the same time already pre-qualifying what it is. It's very complicated and very, let's say, classic philosophical problem, in fact, right? How do you discern a real multiplicity in the sense that you're not simply reducing it to the name that you're giving it beforehand or something like this? So I think that this was something that helped me to engage with the problems of the book and be also more generous with its density and its complication, because there are sometimes good reasons to be ridiculously obscure and dense. And I think that the third point, and that I saw that you guys explored already a lot in the first meeting, is that there is such a strong camaraderie between Alain Badiou and Lazarus that sometimes it feels like you can clarify what he's doing through Badiou's concepts and vice versa. I think that Badiou's engagement with him in metapolitics, some of the footnotes you find in Logics of Worlds, things like this, show that he's evidently working in a very similar framework, and that he feels like he got some stuff right that it's hard for Lazarus to work through without going to this even broader, even more abstract framework, already defining generic procedures, sites, and using a formal machinery. I think that it's a good way to understand what formalization can do for us, to realize that it is a sort of alternative possible solution to the problem of speaking abstractly of singular processes, right? It cuts the ties to concrete situations in a way that natural language has a hard time doing. So Lazarus positions himself in an even harder place than Badiou does, when he can go through the discussion of what an interior is without having to go through interiority in politics, or with French examples from the 70s, 80s in the worker movements. He can define it abstractly, and it's up to us to find out if it has any backing in concrete situations, things like this. So I think that there's also this third kind of interlocution that also helps to make the text more intelligible. So yeah, so those are the kind of the three big forces guiding the way that I read this. And since I'm understanding that my role here is both to coordinate the debate between everyone, but also to make sure that even if it's just a coarse-grained reading, we actually get through the two chapters. I had to, let's say, make that selection. And also during our meeting, I understand that I should try to push forward the reading. So the way that I'm doing this and the sort of things that are catching my attention and help me organize this reading path are very much based on this approach that I'm discussing with you now. I also try to kind of write down a bunch of questions that I saw from section one, from meeting one, that were written in those notes, so that even if they're not directly posed, the moment that we cross them somehow, we can also bring them back into discussion. I didn't really see if there were names attached to all the questions there. It seemed a bit anonymous, which I think is also good. So I just wrote them down. I'm not sure if we will know who asked them, but sometimes that's even better. Yeah, so I'm not sure if anyone wants to start things off with some comments, or if we should dive into the mess that is the chapter. Yeah.
Yeah, so I thought maybe we could start with the question of the real, because I think that the last time that was something that really people spent a lot of time debating, and I think that it is one of the key aspects of the main chapter, like the first chapter that we had to read for this week. And I think that it's really important because I think it offers a kind of a sight of maybe splitting one into two, insofar that I don't think that the real for Lazarus has anything to do with Lacan. And I think that way metapolitics, the section on Lazarus and metapolitics, is very useful because Badiou is very clear. Lazarus is not an anti-philosopher like Lacan. In fact, he's an anthropologist. And I think that relationship between anthropology, the real, and especially the real as not a Lacanian real, but the given in a sociological sense, but not as a state, not in relation to the state, but in traversing itself. And I think that's sort of like the knot that needs to be solved before, and which I think actually explains the rest of the chapters. I think that once you sort of figure that little kernel out, I think the rest of it actually falls kind of in place.
But could you explain, I got it a bit confused. Like you mentioned, the real here is not the real in Lacan. And second, you said, I didn't know if you said it approvingly or critically with regards to sociological.
Sure. Sure. So the examples he gives, and the constellation I think is worth looking at as the theorists he wants to deploy. So the theorists he's talking about typically are Levi Strauss, and how he wants to deploy a kind of structuralist anthropological framework of categorization of concept of categories, which he then calls categories, which is then distinguished from a Durkheimian sociology, and so for him the real is a problem of how to deal with the given, but the given as for us. So that's why he's, for example, critiquing a scientism, which, like for example, the most famous example now would be someone like Mieuxou. I've got Claude Mieuxou stuck in my head, but his son, Claude Mieuxou's son, is the most famous example of this kind of new kind of realism. And I think someone like Lazarus would say, no, no, no. There is no a real, which is an objective real. Rather, it's always a real for us, which is why it's always a subjective, and it's always an interiority. And once you grasp that, then you can basically get this idea of thought thought as a transversal of the real rather than a relation to the real, which was something that was mentioned last week. It's thought of the real, not thought to the real.
Mm-hmm. I mean, because I read it very differently. I mean, I agree with you. I also agree that I'm a psychoanalyst and I don't know exactly what Lacan means by real. So I prefer that we don't suppose that it is the Lacanian real, for the simple fact that everyone will have a hard time understanding anything just because they compare to another thing they don't understand. But one thing that I think is I just wanted to bring an image that helped me, an analogy that helped me, see if it fits with what you're saying or if you would disagree. And the analogy is based on this paragraph here of the chapter that we're, it's a paragraph that's on page 62. Can you guys see what do you prefer that I zoom in or is it okay? Is it okay? Here at the end of this paragraph on page 62, he will say, the relation of thought and of the real proposed here is different in that the real to which I refer erupts into thought as that which will be at stake and in question for thought to think. So I think that's a good kind of, this quote really organized my understanding of what he means, in the sense that, okay, let's start with the idea that the real is what is at stake. And one image that I'm having a hard time moving past, and I think that, and my impression is that it is very powerful because it's something that Badiou mobilizes a lot. And in fact, my opinion, my private reading of Lazarus is that if you want to get the best text from Badiou to see where the connection is not the text that he quotes Lazarus, but is the book called Concept of Model. Because there he gives a critique of anthropology, a critique of positivism, basically a critique of representation in the social sciences, based on a different understanding of what the modeling relation is. I think we'll have other opportunities as we go along to see how this connection could be used. But the image that I think is, the analogy that I think it's useful, and that it connects crazily, and the reason that I think it's good, it's because it connects in a very weird way with Lacan, in the sense that it clarifies what the real is in psychoanalysis better than the opposite, is the following. Let's for 1 second forget, let's say, the Lacanian metaphysics, because the Lacanian philosophy suggests that what we talk about the real in psychoanalysis concerns not only what happens to a patient in the clinic, in the interiority of a clinical process, but what arrived in the interior of the clinic actually concerns the exterior, meaning it concerns, for example, a genetic sense. You learn something about the history of the patient by what happens in the clinic. But the fact is that there is actually an analogy that connects Lazarus, a certain understanding of the real that I think is very simple, in fact, in psychoanalysis, and formal systems in general. And I think that it's very helpful. Sorry for such a long preamble, which is, for example, let's say you're interested in a series of numbers. For example, Fibonacci sequence. What is the real of the Fibonacci sequence? It's not the question, what is a number? Doesn't help you at all to understand what is the real of it. Or the question, the general question, what are number series? Doesn't help you at all. What happens is that if you apply this series, you will see what numbers are interesting, are connected, which numbers appear in the series, which numbers do not appear. What ratio converges in the series, what ratio doesn't converge in the series. So the ratio, for example, between two numbers summed together, like the Fibonacci, the golden number, golden number it's called in English, right? It is at stake in the series. It is, in the sense, it connects with the Lacanian idea that the real is not out there, it's within a certain protocol, but at the same time that it's produced in that protocol, it's not the same thing as, let's say, what you set out to do. Is not the same thing as, you don't capture anything of it by externally asking questions. The questions are part of the process of looking at the numbers that actually appear in the series as you compute it further. It will discern a series of numbers that are interesting, other numbers that are not. It will produce important questions and other questions that are irrelevant. Questions like, are all numbers even that are all numbers that appear are even in the Fibonacci question? Is a stupid question because you quickly see that's not the case. But are all numbers that appear every time a prime number appears, is it also in the prime position in the series? That's an interesting question. So to be at stake is kind of to be produced in the process. It's an interior process. It resists intelligibility, right? But it's not at the same time, let's say, out there, given in the sense of a matter of factual confirmation, because it's absolutely indistinguishable from the process of identifying it, which I think is something that he stresses a lot. I mean, that way of defining the real is not the Lacanian way, because Lacan has a lot of other commitments, for example, to the genetic aspect of metapsychology. But it's actually, in my practice, a much better way of thinking about the real, because that's what happens. People start speaking, and as they speak, they stumble across stuff that matters. And the question is, what the hell is that? Why is that repeating? What are you going to do about that? Those are kind of, there's a very kind of subtle pragmatics that you will find both in mathematical practice, in clinical practice. And I think, in my opinion, that's what he refers to in this sense. I'm not sure if that's where you were going, that's what you were aiming at, Drew, but that's kind of how I approach this.
I think that we can just start with something like where you started before everyone joined, right? There's the given of Brazil. There's a givenness of Brazil, but the thing is you can make no objective statement about Brazil. All you can do at that point is, for Lazarus, is say, okay, there's a givenness that is Brazil, but that gives me no data. So what we have to do then is through, so he has two axiomatics, which are connected by the anthropology of the name, right? There's the axiomatic, which is people think, and then there's the second axiomatic, which is the thought is a relation of the real. So he's stuck with these two parallel processes, and the way that he wants to traverse them is through the name, which has got to do with the question of singularity, right? So the way you know something after is through the historical mode. So the so let's take, for example, if you want to use one from Badiou, Badiou's ontology is pivoted on a singularity of a certain set of, on set math, set theory. Later on, it'll become other kinds of mathematics as well, which are then his new singularities. The singularity then opens up a mode of thinking which allows for a multiplicity of possible interpretations. So like, for example, let's take a singularity. One singularity will be Althusser. And for me, Althusser is a singularity, but after that, you have multiple Althusserianisms. You have Badiou's version of Althusser, you have Lazarus's Althusser, but then you have Vittorio Morfino's Althusser. So for him, the moment of the singularity allows for a historical mode, which allows for multiple thoughts. And that means that the given is always a provisional, limited given, which is the real. And that's always why he calls the second phase, the second axiomatic has a concept of knowledge, which is, yeah, so I'll leave it there. But I think that this is, for me, that the real is got to just do with something as simple as the given of Brazil, the given political conditions in Brazil. And then after that, you have to stuck with knowledge and try to interiorize that reality you live in. I mean, but that's very banal from my perspective.
Yeah, well, I agree with you in part. And I mean, I don't want to kind of monopolize this, and I would like us to move forward, but just as a sort of, so let me try to summarize two interpretations that we have thus far, so we can check as we go. So Drew, the thing that I understood from what you're saying, please correct me if I'm wrong, is to think the real as, let's say, what situates the thinking. So Brazil, in your example, would be this sort of clear indistinct, as he calls it, right? It just gives us, let's say, the grounds where then through inquiry we then process, we proceed. So inquiry would be connected for you with the idea of knowledge, and real with this, let's say, or kind of basic indication of the reference of that inquiry. Is that correct?
Except that it's always from the perspective of you have no access to the real as objective, as an object. It's always a subjective process. Okay, so let's say it's not like when you go to Brazil, you're just collecting the sort of impersonal data. That's where actual engagement and inquiry comes in. And you're not catching anything that's actual about Brazil either.
I see. Okay. So my counter proposal, which is very much based on again not understanding Brazil at all, it would be inverse of this. Would be to connect, let's say, interiority to the claim that there is something to be researched in a situated way, and to connect the real to what is at stake, or what appears to be at stake, what erupts as being at stake once we start producing inquiries. And why is this the alternative that I tend to prefer? Because the reason why I started reading Lazarus is very specific, I mean, I tried to read him, I didn't understand anything, and then I realized he was very smart, because in my political organization, at some point, we started having to, I mean, we've been together for 10 years working on a bunch of stuff, and suddenly we realized we didn't know what our organization actually does. I mean, we know what it objectively does, but what is it doing when it's doing what it does, right? I mean, what is it actually thinking that is not what we say about it to ourselves? And there were problems that the way we described our own activity to ourselves wasn't really cutting it to explain why things didn't work or why problems were appearing, things like this. I'm not sure if it's because there's a bunch of psychoanalysts involved in this thing, so we all want some unconscious thought to appear from somewhere, but so that might be a bit of a distortion of the book. But the problem of separating the representation of political activity from the thinking that is actually effective in a political movement was a bit the basis of this. So I don't see, from my perspective, I don't see the necessity of separating as two moments, the moment of the real and the moment of knowledge, with connecting the real to the first statement. There is, people think, or there is a thought happening, for example, in a certain setting, to the second, which concerns knowledge and the inquiry. Because otherwise, I think that there was a question in the notes that I think was really good. I really like, especially the very kind of, the questions that preface themselves with, guys, this is going to be really dumb, but usually they were very complex problems. But one of those were like, okay, but what is Lazarus then just saying, we should respect and acknowledge that, you know, people think about their problems in the best way. They are the best representatives of their own situation. And I don't think that that's really his contribution. No wonder that he is at the same time so distinct and so close to thinkers like Althusser and other French theorists of the time. Because the problem is, how do you move to this immanent, embedded position, situated position, and still have tools to distinguish between what we say we think and what we actually think, right? How do we distinguish between my representation of myself with all these cool, radical words, you know, but what is actually happening with these terms in an actual situation? So I go through situations here in Rio de Janeiro where terms like worker are mostly used to exclude workers from politics, because 90% of the working class in Brazil doesn't fit what a socialist in Rio thinks workers are. So the term simply doesn't operate with the reference that has anything to do with workers. So the term worker refers to workers in some general exterior sense. It has workers as objects, but it's impossible to participate in anything that concerns workers in real if you use that term to organize, to discern, to know what the fuck is going on. You need something else. So you're not thinking, let's say, the effectivity of political practice doesn't necessarily go through that term when it works, when it, let's say, participates in worker activities. You need to know that distinction. So how can we save that distinction between words and thinking if we abdicate from that distance between political philosophy and actual political practice, or radical theory that is let's say, used as it is inherited, an actual engagement in some situation, right? Usually you have to choose between these two things. Either you represent the situation with the terms you have, that you inherited, that you read about, or you actually kind of use the words and terms as they appear. So my impression is that if you were to define the contribution, it's the concept of the real is interesting in the sense that it's removing itself from the position of object. It's no longer the real workers, the object of my inquiry, but it's becoming more like the moment where representations start folding upon themselves to ask, okay, but what the hell do we actually mean? We're talking about workers here, but only white academic guys came. What we actually mean by workers apparently is not what we thought, right? I lack in my political practice the tools to ask those questions in a meeting. Like we do this all the time. Like we organize this thing. Only a very specific group of people appear that speak that language, that think that way. And I don't even have the like names or operators to ask, okay, guys, I think we did something wrong, which is not just someone here is either an opportunist or a ultra leftist. Like we need other tools to fail in different ways, right? Yeah, Alexander.
Yeah, I mean, I thought one of the moments in the text, I can't seem to quite find it, but I think it's around that page 62, is that in distinguishing between like a scientific mode of thought and the kind of inquiry that he's interested in, it seems like he's positing that the real is always heterogeneous. And so like the real of a psychoanalytic discourse might be different than the real of mathematics, might be different than the real of physics. And it's not, you know, positing a kind of general theory of some singular unified discourse, but is like rather recognizing that in any rational sequence or process, there's thought happening, and all of this is happening within thought, but in relation to with the something real, right? But which is not, which in the sciences, right, sort of operates as the object, but he's trying to get away from that to what I would take to be a more general level that's more flexible, that's able to intervene in the sorts of political situations that you're describing, where it's not necessarily helpful to come like armed with sociology and say like, this is like what the social is, and here are the categories that we're using. You have to kind of inhabit the discursive, circulating subjectivity of the space that you enter.
Mm-hmm. And I think that a good way to put what you just said in connection with this general argument of science, this critique of scientism, or is ultimately also a critique of social science as a method, I think, which is a really crazy thing to argue in a book of, I don't know, 200 pages, you know, for the sort of ineffectivity of social sciences as a whole, almost, is that when you try to ask that question in this sort of very engaged way. How can I distinguish between words and names and thinking, right? Some names are effective, and they have a referent that is connected with that process, and it might be a totally different referent than we expected simply by looking at the word. But even so, we don't know what it's thinking because we need to see this thing in process to see what the hell is going on. It's a sort of epistemology, right? But again, the problem is that the moment that you call it epistemology, you're supposing you're going to bring back all the kind of formal machinery of social sciences, broadly speaking, where this will always happen in the same way. So I think a good way of talking about the challenge is you want to be able to not only singularize the real to the situation, but the means of identifying the real are equally singular, right? And I think that there is one twist to this, which is important because I don't think that he spends enough time on this, but my impression, especially from his connection to Badiou, is that it couldn't be otherwise, is that this is not to say that you shouldn't use all this tradition of social theory, Marxist thinking. It's not like you cut off history and all the struggle from everyone that came before you and you leave it be, right? The problem is, okay, once you have, let's say, relations that are happening in that real, right? They are inside that very thing. Then you look at what is useful and what is not, right? I think that's also what Drew is saying. If you're relating to the real, we're always on the side of what you inherit theoretically, and you simply ask what you're going to apply. When you're within the process, the whole kind of tradition now is, let's say, resignified from the standpoint of what it would mean for that situation, right? For example, one thing that I think is a good example, I think you organize people much better in Rio, like when we do stuff with informal workers. I don't know how you call camelos, like people with these small shops on the street selling counterfeited stuff. Like their whole image is based on the fact they're like Jeff Bezos or something, like they're the greatest entrepreneurs of all time. Don't criticize that. You're not going to be able to do anything and work with people if you, first thing you do is say, all your image of what you do is wrong. Sometimes you need to be able to mobilize a lot of liberal theory terms and things like this, because those things have reference in that situation to the effect of actually getting people in the same place to organize, let's say, how they're going to price their own work or things like this. So changing that shift from general theory to the situation, and then from the situation seeing what theory is useful and all the sociology and what is useful, is also a very risky movement, because it also kind of shifts the weights of what theoretical contributions are useful and which contributions are not that useful in a given conjuncture, I think. And it requires some plasticity, I think, of, if you don't have the clarity that something is being thought with words, something is being thought that you like with words that you don't like, you just go home and you feel so dirty. It's terrible. So you need that. It's a very, very practical distinction, I think. It's very useful, Sorry, yeah?
So it seems to me that the conception of the real is implicated in terms or regimes of representation of a given situation in which the real is always already there. And so we might have something sort of as regards what Alex had brought, we might have different valences, so to speak, of the real that might be nuanced across different kinds of regimes of representation, whether it's psychoanalysis or sociology. But I wonder to what degree what we're really getting at here too is how perhaps multiplicity and interruption together are both, in a certain sense, both indefatigable and even inerasable terms that might evince the indeterminacy that's implicated in the elasticity of politics as such. And so I wonder if the real is something that it's always going to be sort of broached in a nuanced way, sort of obliquely through regimes of representation, but what it's really sort of getting at is the way in which you have indeterminacy and the elasticity in which that indeterminacy seems to always be fluctuating and interrupting. I don't know, do you buy that? Is that...
one thing that, what do you guys think of this? Because I agree that there's this, let's say, I actually started thinking about this in a different way after I read, that text by Badiou, Can Politics Be Thought?
Yeah.
Because it's an intervention which I think is very connected to Lazarus in a very kind of exemplary French context of the 70s and 80s. And he does something that I think that clarified a lot of things to me, but it's so weird, which is that he sounded almost like an analytic philosopher. He said, you guys have no idea what stuff refers to in politics. Like, the political has no reference. Politics has references. Like, it's weird to see a French philosopher talking about really existing references rather than words, equivocation. And my impression, I'm not sure if you guys agree with this, is that both Lazarus and Badiou have an alternative to the French praise of equivocation and the connection between the real and the equivocation, would go something like, you guys are right that stuff is equivocate. We don't know what words mean. They can mean a lot of stuff, but you guys can't really decide what words mean because they're not really going anywhere. If you go to places, you will see the words, they do mean different things, but they mean determinately different things. So rather than a praise, rather than connecting the real to the word, to the equivocation of the word, they connect the real to the multiplicity of references, of domains of reference. So you solve the problem through a very pragmatic point of view. You want to know what the word refers to? Talk to people and you will know. Like, okay, perhaps in the analytic clinic or something like this, it's good as a heuristic point of view to say, you don't know, words slide, the real of meaning or whatever. But in politics, if you talk to people, you will see what words do. Like it's a very context-based approach, which is kind of counterintuitive for me, because for me, like in my own prejudice, I always assume that some European writer of the 70s is always praising how words are multiple, things can mean everything. But it's a very interesting kind of way out of that kind of dead end for political words, right? I'm not sure if that's where you were heading at, but that's also something that I think helps us, in fact, to get back to the text, because this really clarifies why this guy spends so long separating the first statement from the second. Because the moment you say, I can only know what words mean by their domains of reference, there's very little you can actually say as a first statement, right? And you really need to empty it out, that first statement, from a lot of stuff that would be implicated in it. So my impression is that this helps us to, let's say, this idea of, very simple idea of, go to places. Words refer to things in places. They don't refer to things, period, right? Stuff refers to other stuff in a place, in a time. If you go to that place in that time, you kind of will know what words mean. There is no, if you try to kind of equivocate on stuff, you will just sound, pedantic. Sorry, I think, yeah, hey.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're pointing to some of the themes which are developed later in the Workers' Anthropology article, in which he introduces the concept of problematic words, in which it's not so much a matter of the reference of words, but rather of opposing prescriptions that are made within a word, which may be worker, for example, or immigrant in his examples. And so, I mean, this is, I think, the way that he counterposes polysemy, the polysemy of words, to prescriptions, which are specific, antagonistic, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But I also wanted to raise a kind of methodological point for our reading, and I imagine you were going to get to this anyway, but I want to me, it seems that a lot of these questions, which appear to be questions of a general theory about the character of thought, the category of the real, and so on, it seems to me that for Lazarus, all of these terms are embedded in particular intellectualities. And these intellectualities are the ones that he associates with specific historical modes of politics. And which he says is the thought of thought. And in the second chapter that we're reading for today, he goes through the historical modes of politics, and it's quite clear, I think, for example, it's already come up in a sense, thought is not the same as consciousness, for example. And consciousness is a category which he associates with the classist and Leninist modes of politics. And I think these terms aren't comprehensible without situating them in these historical modes of politics. I think that a great deal is at stake in understanding precisely what classism was and then what Leninism was. And I think the other two modes on either side, which are the revolutionary mode and the dialectical mode, I think they don't give us as much of the foundational categories here, but I think that we get them. There's a constant association of classism with positivism and so on. And so I think that an understanding of these historical modes of politics is in a sense a key to understanding the what appear to be the more general statements, because he says there is no politics in general. And you know, if we're talking about a framework which says that politics is thought, I mean, what are we doing if we're talking about thought in general? I mean, this is problematic already. So for this reason, for me, the reading, and I think from my reading of the text, it is motivated in this way, in that we are thinking through our relation to these historical modes of politics.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It makes a lot of sense because, I mean, it's not for nothing that he prefers in chapter 1 to give kind of an account of his own take on Lenin and how he changed his position. I mean, he's kind of doing it, kind of letting us know that we should do that, right? You're right. I think it's a danger to kind of take these things and discuss them kind of broadly, abstractly, rather than in the context of what he's, let's say, moving past or answering to and things like this, right? If I understood correctly your comment. Okay, so should we perhaps, I mean, it's hard to know exactly what level of detail we should go through.
I think since we're hitting the hour mark, Gabriel, it might be most useful if you plow through a kind of formal presentation so we make progress. Unless there are any kind of final questions or comments about everything that's been said thus far. Because I know you have a great presentation here to offer.
Yeah, no, I didn't really prepare like a schematism of the whole thing. I just kind of selected stuff, but we're discussing most of it. I'm worried that since the reading is so hard, also giving it we shouldn't do this in a way that we end up correcting my reading or discussing my reading rather than discussing the book,
right?
Which is a danger as well. So okay, I can just start going, let's say, very kind of informally through some of the passages that I separated.
Yeah,
we don't need to read them.
Yeah, let me just remind people that we don't really have a policy for interventions. You just sort of speak, and so far it's worked out. So if you want to jump in, jump in.
Sure. So basically what I did is that I just kind of separated some selections. I compressed the two chapters in a bunch of quotes. I added some crazy stuff like this, but I'll just use it for my own benefit in the case I need to suggest that I you know, my reading is very good, but otherwise I think we can skip that sort of thing and just bring it in if it's useful. So I'll just do like a kind of very coarse-grained account of some stuff in these chapters, and then we can stop and discuss them and go through the quotes as you guys see fit. Daniel, so since I'm with doing the screen sharing thing, it's complicated for me to keep track of also of the chat. If you guys don't mind bringing those questions into the discussion for me, I'll have a hard time mediating that. So yeah, so he begins the chapter with a kind of very dense summary of what he's proposing. It's very similar to things that he's said already in the preface. He already presents right at the beginning the two constitutive statements of this anthropology of the name, how it's going to establish what he calls a basis for knowledge of thought, and to open up the prospect of a thought with no object. So he proposes these two statements. People think, right, which I think in English is a bit more, it's hard, it's easier to misread it because the people and people are so close together. In a sentence, it can be confusing, but in French, gens, we also have in Portuguese, gente. Some languages have this idea of, you know, folks in the sense of some people, right? An indistinct amount of people, not the people. So people think, and thought is a relation of the real, which is already, I mean, one of the big points of discussion we had this far, the very strange formulation of a relation of the real. He says he's gonna bring this anthropology to, let's say, reconfigure studies of something which until now has been called forms of consciousness, subjectivity, and representation. So he's intervening in changing something about how we understand this concept. He says that this is a rational anthropology in interiority. And here again, we see that he plays a lot with this sort of particle of the real in interiority, where giving a bit of a torsion, applying it in a way that we're not used to, already points, I think, to two things: how important a certain very special spatiality is at stake in his thought. So thought of thought, relation of the real, investigation in interiority rather than in exteriority. There's a lot at stake in this particles like of and in. And he makes that distinction. So he brings these two statements in, tells us that they're gonna kind of open up to an investigation, a rational anthropology in interiority. He opposes this interiority to a different approach, which is in exteriority. And says that with this, we examine what is thought in the thought of people, which brings also a different kind of special grammar, another torsion of language that he does, that he will pick up again with the idea of reiteration. That's quite crucial. He, right after that, he says, look, I don't want you, he kind of teaches us how to connect the two statements. He spends a long time discussing how do you move from one statement to the other, right? So there is something in this gap from people think to thought is a relation of the real, that he wants you to realize that there is a separation, and he wants you to ask questions about how you move from one to the other. This shouldn't be, let's say, immediate or commonsensical, in the sense people think, and the second statement, they think about politics or something like this. The questions that arise in between the two, or the problem of how to connect them, is a relevant problem of this discipline that he's proposing, and of the general framework within which he also distinguishes other fields, right? He calls the move from the first statement to the second a sort of confrontation. So he says, what makes this anthropology original is not only that there is no external system of reference, meaning there is an internal system of reference, but also that the relation of people and their thought is not reflexive. Instead of being reflexive, is one of confrontation. So I think that this also points to this idea that we're not moving to this contextual situated reference to simply take at face value what is said of that reference. There is a confrontation between thinking and thinkability, right? Confrontation that emerges from interrogating the thought of people about what they think. This is already a weird formulation, I think. Interrogating the thought of people about what people think. So the about introduces the sort of semantics, right? There is an aboutness to what people saying. What are they talking about? But this aboutness is not given by the things they're saying necessarily. It's not immediately there. So it's not reflexive in the sense that we want to see how people represent themselves, but it's also not without, let's say, a confrontation or some level of specularity, or whatever you want to call this sort of second level, right? We want to confront what is given with something else. Then he introduces this idea. I had a hard time organizing some of these concepts, so it would be really good also if you guys could help me with this. He says, okay, regarding this first statement, people think, he connects it with this idea of intellectuality. He says, from what I understood, there's something like intellectuality and thinkability as a sort of, intellectuality refers to the first statement in the first process, and thinkability refers to the second statement and the second process that he separates, right? So he calls intellectuality the fact that there is thought. So people think doesn't say what people think, how this is singularly identifiable, but it says there is something to be looked at, right? There is a place for you to go and look. So there is a sort of, I think intellectuality has something to do with, let's say, a claim to intelligibility, right? There is something intelligible that emerges where people are doing stuff. But he separates this from the second statement. He says, look, just because there is thought, it's not necessary that the thought of this thought is stated. To say people think doesn't tell us anything about what is being thought in that thought. So again, you see that he's very careful with how we move from the first statement to the second, right? Not only this, he wants this statement to also be conditioned by the possibility of a plurality of such first statements, right? So there are intellectualities in the plural. To say that there's something being thought, or there is thought in a certain domain, with regards to a certain internal frame of reference, to the limit that such a thing exists, is not the same thing as to say that it only exists there. In fact, it's the opposite, right? It's because there are multiple intellectualities that we will be able to talk about multiplicity of rationalism. We'll be able to talk about a multiplicity of reals or protocols for identifying the real. I'm not very clear exactly on on how he distinguishes this from Althusser's specular relation. My impression is that is a way of casting aside the idea that just because we're claiming not to know what people are thinking, that doesn't mean that what they will tell us about it, so their imaginary relation to the real conditions of existence, is itself that thought. On the contrary, I think as the book goes along, it becomes clearer that we're actually waging that political situations have the resources to distinguish between the imaginary relation they establish with the real conditions and the actual thinking of those conditions, right? So that rupture is immanent to a political process and not something we as political philosophers are the only ones who can do.
Gabriel, on the Althusser point, is this a way that you read Althusser's commitment to psychoanalysis in his theory of like the political subject, because he uses the term specular? I'm actually not clear on that reference. I don't know if you can help.
Lacan has a theory of specular relation, you know, like the whole mirror state, seminar one, imaginary. I take specular here to be reference to the imaginary via Althusser, but perhaps there are more precisions to the concept in Althusser's work that I'm not picking up on. But that's, let's say, the ballpark of the meaning of the concept.
He's saying that the anthropology of the name eschews or sort of is capable of circumventing this specular, is not reliant on the specular. Is that the basic point?
Yeah, the way I understand it is that, I mean, again, I'm reading this through this particular approach where I understand that Lazarus is trying to avoid two pitfalls. Let's say transcendentalism in the claim that we from the outside know what things are, and a relativism in the sense that just because you regionalized a process, you situated a thought, that doesn't mean it is now reduced to a sort of reflexive representation of people by themselves, right? We want a third thing. So we want to be in the situation, but we don't want to have to, because of this, take everything as face value, simply, substitute thinking for the words that people are using. So it's neither a specular relation, this sort of representation of people by themselves in an immediate sense. And he's trying to show that just because there are intellectualities, meaning there are internal frames of reference, we are not condemned because of this to think merely in terms of these imaginary relations. That's what I got from it.
Yeah, one thing to add to that, I think it's in the same passage where he follows it up by saying intellectuality stipulates that there is a thought and thereby delivers it from subservience to any problematic that maintains that a statement on thought must think a minima of the condition of this statement. Then introduces the philosophium, etc. I take it this is part of his, what he's specifying here is your mention of transcendentalism, I think for a moment there, was felicitous insofar as he defines his break with Claude Lévi-Strauss, in that Claude Lévi-Strauss ultimately ends up depending for support from a general external psychology, a philosophy of thought. Almost, I get the idea almost like he links Claude Lévi-Strauss to he says 18th century philosophy of thought, which I take as basically Kant or Fichte, like the apperceptive subject. So I think that might clarify the idea of the specular relation insofar as he's trying to just basically thwart, I don't know, the idea of any psychological subject here.
That's a really good point. And I think that you also brought something else, which is something that happens a lot with, for example, Marxist analysis. I'm very much guilty of this sometimes. You're engaged in a certain situation, people use certain terms or speak in a certain way, rather than looking for the consequences of that thought in that process, or those statements in that process to understand what it means, what it refers to, what it does. You do this sort of critical approach where you look for the social conditions of speaking like that. These guys only speak using these terms of entrepreneurial something because neoliberalism is conditioning everyone to think of themselves as this sort of companies or enterprises, subjective enterprise. I don't know how you approach this in English, but this is a sort of critical approach. You take a statement and you refer the interiority to the conditions of that statement, which are exterior. The other approach is to say, let's take it as immediate, which is the specular version, right? You take the imaginary, the representation someone has of themselves as a given. The second is you compare that representation with its social conditions of possibility. In both cases, you don't get what is being thought. In both cases, you don't follow through what is actually happening and how those terms work in that situation, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I take that as a kind of, I guess, again, I'm a little too probably willing to I don't know, take a little too much recourse to the language of German idealism, but it's a kind of prejudgment as opposed to the, I don't know, what you might call the speculative statements. So for instance, early on in the book, Lazarus suggestively says, hopefully I can get this right, I think it's a footnote, and it's like on the first page of the book proper, and he says that apropos thought, that this is of the order of thought, he says, yes, that this is an this is not an approximation, but meant to designate an analytical space without prejudging its categories. I think that's
Yes.
the line. Yes.
Yes, that's a good point. I think what you bring something up that is a very important point also in understanding, for example, Badiou's praise of axiomatics as a general mode of developing thinking. Because let's say the critical mode or the critical approach judges statements by its conditions, whereas axiomatic mode judges statements by their consequences, right? So you want to see what stuff does before you know what it is. I also find axiomatics a very, let's say, it's a sort of Platonic pragmatism. It's a very nice paradox. But I think it goes very well with what you were saying. And also, I mean, it's kind of a condition, because the only way to actually say there are multiple intellectualities, to say there are multiple frames within which we can see what things are doing, what thought is happening there, is by assuming that there is no common ground of conditions, let's say general economic theory, which is powerful enough to kind of reinscribe every statement back into it. So everything is just a particular expression or a particular kind of symptom, you know, of this general framework. So you don't really need to follow through with what's going on there to understand what is happening. You can simply refer back to this common place. If there is this common place, which you can call the political, you can call whatever you want, then there are no multiple intellectualities, right? And then you're back at a sort of thinking in exteriority, because you identify it from, it's the outside of every interiority, right? So I think that helps us to move from this definition of intellectuality to the statement that there are multiple intellectualities and that they are identified by their modes. And he says a mode will be the operative category of the singularity of each intellectuality. So there is a connection, a strict connection between the singularity, right? How things develop locally, and their multiplicity. If there is no multiplicity, there's also no singularity, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So he makes those two, he brings back those two statements that he presented more informally. They acquire this very noble form of separate parent. Statement one, people think. Statement two, thought is a relation of the real. He again makes a claim that these things, first, that there can be no single statement, which is something that is, again, approximates his way of thinking about statements and prescriptions to an axiomatic approach. There is no such thing as one axiom for a formal system. And he also claims that they are separate statements, and that their relation is something that is going to be important for us. And then he corresponds these statements to two processes. So the first one is a state that I find it very interesting to call this a process. It's very, very weirdly phrased as well. So process one is there is thought. So when you say people think, what you're doing as a process is making a claim in the sense of that, of those kind of claims to existence. Il y a, right? There is thought. You're not saying what is. You're not defining thought. It's an axiom of existence, such as axioms like there is a void set or there is an infinite set. It's not statements of the form, if something exists, then something else follows. Statements of the form, we assume the existence of this, right? And second, it's a process. The second process, it's also written in a weird way. The second process, which goes with thought, is a relation of the real. Process is that which is thought in thought. I don't know, I found it very weird that it's kind of a half sentence, but it also introduces us again to one of those strange ways of phrasing, right? Thought in thought, but kind of for now in a sort of still intuitive way, we start seeing how he works with these categories, because he stopped short of defining this existence that he claimed, there is thought, people think. So there is thought in this place that is people. So he stops short of giving it content. And in the second process, he defines the content that happens in that space also with the same term, with thought, right? So it's a sort of, it really poses a problem to how to relate categories, because the category of what demarcates a place and the category of the content of that place are demarcated with the same category, right? It's not like that which is seen in thought or that which is conceived in thought. It's the same category. Is you affirm something as existing, and then the determination of the concept appears from within that space, right? So I see the relation between the two statements as a sort of, one demarcates the existence of a place, and the second will extract from that demarcation a determination for that place, right? Something like this.
Yeah, which he calls a mode.
Yeah, exactly. So, but again, it's, and then we get also, I mean, already a bit more determination because of these ideas, because by calling it the mode, you're calling the mode two things, right? The identification of that thought and that thought. Right? I mean, to identify the content of the statement, there exists some thinking there, to enrich the determination of what thinking is in that place is the mode. But the mode is also a mode of identifying this thought, right?
So this
Sure.
might be a naive question, but so far reading this, my question in the back of my mind is, where's the object in all of this? And in a certain sense, is Lazarus, is he displacing the object to the position of a mode? Is it, I don't know. I guess that's my question.
No, I think why is it that the most complex questions are always prefaced with, I have a naive question? But yeah, I don't know, man. I think we'll get, I think he's very hermetic about this. He makes these distinctions between object, objectal, objective, objectivist. But there is one quote that I like for this. I separated it here. Perhaps it's helpful. I think I have it as a separate thing. He says, "My intention is not to assert that thought is always without an object, but rather to locate the question of the object as a particular case specific to the scientific approach and a specificity of the scientific mode of intellectuality, and not as an invariant for all thought or all rational thought." So I think the two things, I mean, I think this partially answers in the sense that to ask for the object of a thought would be an effective question in a scientific procedure.
Yeah.
Insofar as you don't want your perception, your prejudices to be confused with the thing that's being thought. So the subject-object division is actually effective there, whereas it might be distorting and specular in politics, from what I understand. But I think that there's also, in a more, let's say, naive sense, I think that to say that he's just relocating the question also leaves open another way of approaching this, which is to say, well, it's not like people are not, there are no objects in politics. But one thing is, even in the example that I mentioned, for example, this analogy with, you know, the study of prime numbers. Prime numbers are not an object in the sense that they're, when you do that, you're already into philosophy of mathematics, asking what is a prime number. When you're studying prime numbers in the protocols of the Fibonacci or of a prime sequence or whatever, or finding prime numbers among the integers, they're in the process of finding something and the thing you're trying to find, they're indistinct in a certain sense, right? So you don't need to have the object as the counterpoint of thinking. It might be the case that in some intellectualities, the word object actually operates as an effective category. It does stuff to think in terms of objects. But I think what he does is to say, this is not an invariance. Like, you need to also approach these internal frames of reference with the possibility that they don't work with that same structuring. Whereas, for example, this is something that I find very, very relevant, for example, in effective ways of talking about organizing. Like, organizations are not really, it makes no sense to talk about people, some people are organizing and others are the objects of organization. If people are organized, they're also organizing in a sense, because they are also active. There is no passivity and activity in such clear-cut sense. So I think that's a good example of how that way of thinking through the categories of a political process might be deceiving. If you suddenly are thinking, who are the people who are being treated by politics and who are the people who are doing the politics, suddenly you lose something, right? So to detach thinking from thinking of an object and to go back to this idea, but very Parmenidean, that in some sense, the correct way to approach thinking, or the broader way to approach thinking, is one where thinking is identified with the process and not with the material of the process, right? People are thinking while they do a bunch of stuff, but of course they're doing stuff to objects, but it doesn't mean that the objects are the best reference to understand what's going on. I don't know, something like this.
So my concern also is more than just, or rather not so much about thinking with regard to an object that's a counterpoint to the subject or thought, but object as constitutive of subjectivity as such. I'm not a Kantian, but the idea that the object, the form of the object as such, as being an a priori form of intuition and therefore constitutive of subjectivity or experience. I wonder if that also is somewhat of a threat to Lazarus' idea of this interiority of subjectivity, pure or qua subjectivity. And also, you know, to that degree too, thinking of the Kantian object as an a priori form, I mean, that seems also somewhat commensurate with, and I know to think Lacan or to think Lazarus through Lacan might bring a lot of error our way, but that idea also of separation being constitutive of subject or subjectivity. So again, my fear is not so much where does the object go with its sort of correspondence to subjectivity, but more so at a deeper level, where is the object if the object really is, or objectivity itself is constitutive of the subject in a sort of retroactive process.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone has a particular answer to this. My particular approach, and I think that it has something to do especially with Lacan, but how I would get from this is that I think this is a book on how to become more intimate with the thinking that goes on in political processes. If it doesn't agree with Kant, it's for the worse for Kant, but in the sense that if it is more effective, if it works better, if you discern more of the world of politics by abdicating of this presupposition, then we should do it. And we will only know if it's better or not by actually doing it, engaging in political practice, where the question about, but what are the conditions of possibility of people relating to the world in this way or that way, might not necessarily lead us closer to it. It will lead us back to an idea of what is the basic, I don't know, transcendental constitution of individuals, regardless of if they're doing politics or not. And in the case of Lacan, I think it's a good example of a thinking that is not of the object, because the first break that Lacan did with psychoanalysis of his time was to move from the object to the other. Subjects in psychoanalysis are correlated with others, not with objects. Yeah. So I don't care if you're speaking about objects. My question is who you're speaking to. You see, like you shift the question and you gain more intelligibility. Like, stop worrying about if what the guy is saying is true or false about what happened to him outside of the clinic. Start wondering, who is he pretending to be speaking to when he's here? Who is he addressing? That's what increases intelligibility. And I think that he does something similar by making that shift, right? It's even broader than Lacan, because Lacan is doing kind of philosophy in the background. I don't think he's worried about this. Like, this is a problem for philosophers after Lazarus to rethink, okay, but if this is possible, what else, what is structural about subjectivity? But first, I don't think that he's at any point suggesting that subjects are individuals, which is an important point, right? To ask what is being thought is not to ask what is John thinking about. So people can be very well Kantian in their structure, and politically it's still irrelevant. So yeah.
Thank you.
I just have a little bit of a thought. I feel like Deleuze and Guattari might provide a little bit of a way out of this by thinking thought as the sort of collapse of difference, right? That our difference in the world is real, and that our understanding and articulation of that works through collapsing all these different stimuli into the categories of thought through these learned processes, through circulating notions. So if you're coming at it from a sort of Lacanian or Kantian standpoint, one of the problems that anthropologists deal with a lot is this idea of, the excess, right? The what exists beyond the things that we cognize. Maybe that helps. I don't know. I'm not a philosopher, so.
I think that question connects a lot with a question that was made in the notes about Viveiros de Castro and the sort of Deleuzian-inspired anthropology and things like this. I'm not sure if you guys were there. But
well, I just made it. I just joined up a couple of days ago, so I haven't made it through all the notes yet.
No, I'm just saying that it seems like it's a question that many people have. It's a good question, not to diminish your intervention.
I got a quick question.
I didn't take it as such.
Yeah, no, sorry. My point is just that I don't know how you guys think about this, but one thing that I always thought was complicated is that I feel like, I'm not sure how you guys feel about this, but I always feel like people with a more Deleuzian inclination, that I do call it. Sorry, somebody wants to ask something. That's right. Oh, there's people who I work with who have a more Deleuzian inclination seem to be more ready to pay attention to something that is going on in a process that doesn't really refer to anyone in particular, which I think is very good. I'm learning from that, but at the same time, a harder time to not call it philosophy. Like you have a good take on autonomy, but not the best take on, let's say, its singularity or interiority. Like you get a good take on singularity in thinking, but not necessarily a good take on okay, man, this refers to these conditions on this way. You can't generalize out of it, and you cannot learn something for, philosophy out of what these guys are doing here necessarily. Like there are a bunch of steps to that. And I think that on the other hand, Lacanians are quite good of recognizing how an interior affects what happens inside of it, but they're not very good with leaving behind the sort of remainder of a reference back to the body, to the individual as the place of the subject. So accepting, for example, that organizations think, right? It's something that's taken in an organization. So,
yeah. Quick question. Oh, okay, Alex, you got it.
Well, I mean, I thought that it might be somewhat clarifying to Frank's question about the object. And I don't know how Lazarus relates to this per se, but like in the course of Althusser's thought, right? He moves from thinking that from looking for Marx's object or the object of Marx's theory to a place where he starts to say that sciences have an object, but philosophy has no object, right? And so this idea that thought has no specific object, I mean, I'm sort of collapsing philosophy and thought here, but like thought doesn't think any one thing specifically because of that flexibility, that plasticity that we were talking about, right? Anything that's thought is happening in thought. So that question of like, what is thought in thought, that recursive point, I mean, that's where I kind of got, like, it becomes a little bit murky, but also a really important question, because it's not always clear what that referent is, or what is like, or there's always like a kind of spacing, right, where thinking has to be expressed and communicated in like various notions to other people, and that's all part of that. All of that is happening in subjectivity or in interiority, from a certain perspective. And I thought like the engagement with Foucault sort of clarified that for me, like where for Foucault it seems like discourses are this exterior, like occurring in the sphere of exteriority, right? There's like almost a kind of objectivity there. It seems like what Lazarus is interested in is the pivot to the immanence of a discursivity, right, which is just thinking and communicating between people, right? This sort of attempt to locate that through a political organization.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, yeah. So like, I don't want to just like transpose that Althusserian philosophy has no object line into this, but I think that that side of that project seems to be being taken up by Badiou and Lazarus in some ways.
I think that there's a thread there we can pull to go back to the text, which I think it's not for nothing that all of us go to, let's say, when we try to understand what these two processes mean and the lack of reference to the object, we're somehow pulled back into philosophy, because that's where, in exteriority to politics, there is some development on the idea of thinking with no object, right? And I think that it's not for nothing that the next pages in the book are then, suddenly he turns to a critique of social scientism, this idea of that the only way you can resolve this proposal is going back to a broader framework, a general framework, because otherwise you're stuck. So it's interesting that the moment that he says there are multiple intellectualities, thought is a relation of the real, means that we need to identify through a mode what is at stake in a process. We stumble in a definition that, or in a proposal that has no clear definition, no stakes on objects, or doesn't designate an objectivity or a nature, as he says here in the last line. And our tendency when we move towards something like this is to move back to philosophy, to a sort of structural approach to the general field of politics. And the next thing he does is to criticize this, right? And he says that he wants to break this statement people think breaks with a particular scientific rootedness of thought, right? And it seems like we're moving towards an anti-rationalist approach. And then he tries to justify that this is not what he's doing, but also that and I think that there's a nice kind of side quest to the book, which is he's trying to invite us to consider politics on politics terms, but he's not dismissing the existence of other forms of thinking. In fact, and I think he could even have explored this more, you get a more immanent idea of other fields if you allow politics to have this particular interiority itself, right? So it's interesting because it's a very strange approach to autonomy, which is a very common theme. For example, the autonomy of art, the autonomy of politics, where other fields benefit from this autonomy, right? The more politics becomes the place where politics thinks politics itself, the less burdened with accounting for it other fields are. So the more interiority becomes an approach, the more science is no longer, let's say, deformed to kind of serve as a crutch for political thinking, right? So you can become. So there is something also. Sorry, somebody is speaking. I interrupted.
No, sorry, Gabe. I was just kind of curious about, like, as you're talking right now. One of the parts in the text that I had the most marginal question marks, just like, what is going on here, is the difference between reiteration and repeatability. And I think like as we've been talking about, and some of the people's like kind of pretty much every question that's been asked in the past like 30 minutes, I think kind of bears on this difference to some extent. But I kind of want to, in some senses, a request, can we like jump to that? Because I thought it was like a particularly interesting part of this chapter. And I kind of wanted to get people's takes.
I totally agree. I also think that he has this thing that multiplicity is another name for the beginning of thought. And so this notion of the beginning or the sort of location of thought, I also feel like we should just review that maybe before we jump to repeatability, because to me, this is on page 52, before he gets into the two statements proper. So I guess now you have two questions, Gabriel, you have to manage.
Actually, and I also wanted to throw in just a third thing.
Please.
I am a non-philosopher, non-academic. So while a lot of these questions I think are very interesting because it really pulls the text open in a lot of ways that I have no real concept for, which I certainly appreciate. I'm in relating to kind of a point Gabe made about framing things within maybe an organizational problematic. I'm interested in trying to understand what Lazarus's ultimate critique of, you know, Marx and classism and Leninism is and everything, which seems to come up later in the text. I mean, we have already that kind of idea that he was this very pure Marxist-Leninist, and then he's going to, you know, kind of move away from that. And as far as something Daniel mentioned too, with the sort of framing of this as being like a socialist think, and that socialist is kind of this problematic in this very, you know, at least American kind of sense. You know, I see these kinds of, you know, this is a potentially interesting intervention from Lazarus in a very kind of nascent left, particularly in like a DSA type organization that I am involved in, and see kind of, you know, weird, you know, you know, people who have no idea what Marx is even talking about, arguing about what Marx is talking about, and then sort of a crude, you know, maybe Marxist-Leninist point of view where the state and revolution is the ultimate, you know, touch point or reference point, right? So I'm interested in kind of seeing how Lazarus can push on that discussion a bit as well. But of course, I recognize that's sort of a very different direction. I just wanted to add that.
I think that the questions are all, I mean, they all connect in one way or another. So the first, so we kind of put the questions in the order that they appear in the book, and we can also use them to move along with the reading. I think the first one was, the first one in terms of how it appears is Daniel's question about how multiplicity connects with intellectuality, right? Or with the beginning of an inquiry or of this decision or statement, or sort of that there is some thinking, for example, people think, right? From what I understood of your question, then is Daniel, your point is that there is a connection, right, between the statement that there is something singular to be thought in a given place, and the statement that this is only possible because we're presupposing a multiplicity of intellectuality, right? So the multiplicity, in the sense that there are many reference domains of reference to which, within which thinking can then take place. It's a condition for us to even state people think, right? For example, not the people think, but some people think there, in that direction, there, go there, right? Something like this. So there is a strong connection between multiplicity in that sense and the possibility of the singular identification of a mode, right, within a certain intellectuality. That's how I understood it. I think it's kind of captured here because he decides to present very, very kind of close together the idea of intellectuality as being something that only goes halfway. It's the fact that there is a thought, right? Which is that this first process that he talks about, the stating that there is a thought, and you stop there. That's the first process. You don't say what is being thought. You don't have the means to say that. And then, because that, as he says here, to go further than that would be to identify its mode, which is already within that particular frame of reference that you first have to name. So at this first point, the condition for you to make the statement, which will open up the place for a singular approach to a singular thought, is that there are multiplicity of possible statements, right? That's what I understood. I think that the fact that he moves from this discussion to the discussion of social science, the scientific rationalism, his critique that there is one rationalism, or that one sole possible form of rationalism that alone is in a position to develop coherent, debatable ideas about reality. So this is what he's criticizing. So the multiplicity of intellectualities is also a multiplicity of rationalities. So it's a big stake of what he's saying, that there are multiple forms of rationality that are conditioned by the fact that there are multiple internal frames of reference, right? So it's a weird place that he's positioning himself, neither general social science about politics, where there is only one big frame of reference for political ideas, nor a relativism where if you have multiple frames, only what is given in that frame as it is given can be called the thinking of that frame. So we want to avoid both things, right? And this keeps open the place for a rationalism that is localized, a situated rationalism. It reminds me a lot, I don't know if you guys like her, but Donna Haraway's idea of situated science has a lot to do with Lazarus, in fact, I think. But just to go then to the second question on reiteration and repeatability, because this is kind of where he goes. I think he actually distinguishes the problem of repetition from the problem of iteration and reiteration. Repetition, from what I gather here from the book, for example, on page 56, 57, appears within the discussion of multiple rationalisms. And he says, look, in physics or in science, repetition, regularity, they are part of what constitutes that frame of reference, right? The very distinction between what is, let's say, noisy and what is information in a scientific experiment is connected with regularity and repetition. But from his perspective, rationality in politics is, on the contrary, concerned with what does not repeat, right? So he makes this distinction here in this paragraph between repetition in physics and non-repetibility with regards to society, right? Which is a sign indicating that society does not pertain to the field of physics. So I think repetibility and non-repetibility, which, I mean, from what I understand, he's kind of very vaguely engaging with the big debate you'll find, for example, in Gilles Gaston Granger and these guys who were studying the use of formal methods in social sciences in France at that time. Was friends with Badiou and all those guys. And the argument against, let's say, psychoanalysis being a science was the problem of repetition and the problem of repeatability of experimentation, verification of statements, you know, all those methodological problems. And he's trying to use non-repetibility, in my understanding, as, let's say, one of the first qualifiers. It's already helping us to identify what is real in the interiority of a certain political process, right? And he's saying just because it's not repeating, just because this thought is not concerned with repetition in this sense of regularity, doesn't mean it's not rational. So it's a very kind of traversal intervention on the debate between Gilles Gaston Granger. I have his books on PDF, I can send you guys. So I think he's separating scientific rationality from rationalism in general, by saying rationalism is a broader framework that will be singularized depending on the quality of what is at stake. In science, what is at stake concerns repetition. The very form of an experiment depends on repetition, depends on a bunch of stuff. But that doesn't mean this will be invariant for all rationalism, or that everything that concerns itself with non-repetition, non-regularity is by definition non-rational, right? I think the question of reiteration is a slightly different question that he introduces a bit later on. Just skip to that point. Because it's kind of how, I think it's a kind of, it's almost like a remark on the very style of the text, right? On the style of his thinking. by saying, if you want to eliminate the thinking of objects as our grammar for thought, this idea of reiteration is very useful. And he uses it all the time, right? He says, thought is a relation of the real, and at some point he will say, you know, different disciplines define differently what is real, what is the real of the real. Or we need to look at, I'm just find the reiteration part. I thought I found it, but it's not there. Not here, yeah. Thought of thought, right? For example, he will say something like, there is no thought without thought of thought. That there is no thought without thought of thought becomes explicit in the category of thinkability. It's a founding prescription for the singular thought that is anthropology of the name. And then he calls this, the reiteration of the word is not reduced to a simple duplication of the first field. And in one of the questions in the notes, somebody asked, can somebody please give me an example of this making any sense, talking in these terms? And I think that, for example, again, in that idea of an axiomatic beginning, for example, I have a set theoretic framework, I can construct the integers, and I want to propose an inquiry on the quality of certain integers, which we call prime numbers. And I want to know how frequent they are, right? I can ask the question, what is being thought in the thought of prime numbers? The thought of prime numbers refers to the axiomatic within which I construct the integers, right? Which are themselves decomposable back into primes. But what is being thought in that thought is a more precise question of what can we say about the thing that we just said exists, right? I did this, perhaps this is useful here, I'm not sure. I thought of this reiteration in this way. For example, imagine you have this statement, right? The thought of thought, the real of the real. I like to use these two terms, I think they help me. Like the question of the thought of thought is, what can I dispose of? What can I extract? What can I see? Or what has become thinkable in the thought that I'm composing, right? That my statements, my prescription, my investigation is driving me towards, right? So this categorical iteration that he develops, this idea where categories can be redoubled without meaning a duplication or a meta category, it's something like the X, right? The thought is what's happening inside in a determinate way at a given moment of the thought, which is the axiomatic or prescriptive domain that we constituted with this investigation. So the thought of prime numbers is the actual information we're extracting about these numbers, which we don't know much about, and it's always hard to find out when a new one is going to appear. In the general framework, the internal frame of reference that we also constituted, called, you know, the prime decomposability of integers or whatever. And this is distinct from the sort of conceptual approach that he opposes to the categorical one. When you say the X of X, you move to a broader field, you move out, right? Rather than in, you move out. What is the concept of the concept? Is rather than looking inside the operations, conceptual operations, you're moving outside to apply them to that field itself, right? So what is the, I don't know, what is the gender of gender? It's a question about the conditions of the construction of the concept of gender. We're moving out and applying that concept to the very basis which gave rise to the concept itself. Perhaps it was already produced under a bunch of presuppositions which are not interesting for us and things like this. So the gender, the X of the X, is moving out. But what he's trying to teach us, kind of force us to think, is a movement where the reiteration moves us inside rather than out, right? The thought of thought is the determination that appears inside this process. I'm not sure if that helps. It helps me, but I'm kind of crazy.
Was there a point where he refers to the possibility, like where he uses the category of reiteration to think about sequentiality, right? To think the possibility of sequence. Is that right? Or am I inventing that?
I don't remember that. I mean, I only found references to iteration in the sort of grammar of anthropology of the name, like a sort of commentary of how we think as anthropologists of the name, right? We want to ask questions such as, what is the real of the real? Because we want to know how a particular singular process constitutes for itself its own subject matter, or what is at stake for it, right? So it's a way of thinking about this. I'm not sure if it's such an operational category in the description of modes and things like this, but perhaps it's something I missed in the book.
Hey, Gabriel, can I ask a question real quick? Thanks so much for the diagram. It's super helpful. I'm wondering though, like in your description of like what somebody who's doing like inquiry in the way that Lazarus sets it up does, it sounds like a lot like the sort of like political analysis that you were talking about in the first part of the lecture, where you listen to people and like the sort of like terms that they're using for describing their like political action, but then you don't take those as like a representation of what they're thinking. You like move in such a way that you ask like what's being thought there in those terms. But like for me, it seems like one thing that Lazarus emphasizes is that political sequences are rare. They're not going on all the time. They're like that's why they can be called like sequences. So it seems to me like there'd be a difference between like the sort of like political analysis that you'd be doing just going out in like everyday ordinary circumstances where people are resisting, and the sort of work of inquiry which seems to happen in these these sort of like sequential moments where like for Lazarus like politics happened right in that moment. So I'm just like wondering about like whether the anthropologist is the same as this like sort of analyst that you were kind of describing in the first half of the lecture, or whether you see them as like different.
Yeah, I don't know, man. Like I have a big problem with the interpretation both in Lazarus and Badiou, that I think a lot of philosophers took the word rare to mean it happens not very often, and then construct a whole kind of melancholic philosophy of preparing for something because we are in between things. And for me, rarity is like saying stars in the sky are rare. It's true. With a lot of pollution, you don't see many stars. But if you look, there are infinite stars in the sky. Like, it's your fault. It's not the star's fault that you're not seeing them. So rarity just means it's not continuous. I don't think it means it's a statement on the frequency, because both for Badiou's events and for Lazarus breaks and political situations or whatever, if you were able to give a content to the word rare, it means you can in exteriority define the frequency, and that goes against everything they're writing. So rarity, I think that they're a bit. Sorry,
just because you say something is rare and it's not frequent doesn't mean that you can suddenly talk about the magnitude of frequency.
Exactly,
So
exactly.
No, but I'm saying is I do think that they're saying that they're that such things, singularities, are very, very infrequent. Otherwise, what you would end up with is a series of infinite names. No, and that's not his point. His point is precisely that there are very few names which open up entire historical modes. And in this way, he's quite conservative. Like he's basically, if you wanted to give a like an analogy to this, would be something like Machiavelli, for example, who would say that there are very specific figures in the history of Rome that open up new modes, but there are very few of them. There's like 4 of them. So I think he's actually talking about a very rare kind of politics. Like politics for him is not something that occurs 99% of the time. And then call it melancholic, but I'm not sure it's melancholic, but rather a kind of realism about it.
Yeah, no, I agree. With their case, I think it's very realistic. I have in mind, let's say, a lot of bibliography on Lacan, which on Badiou, which has a sort of stake on, how to prepare for an event and this sort of more mission. And I think that, I'm not sure if you would agree. What do you think of this? Couldn't we distinguish between the qualifier rare as a sort of realist about past history, which is a contingent statement, versus a statement about the contingency of what happened, versus the statement about rarity, which is a statement about the necessity of rarity in the future. Like, you cannot make the second statement, but you can definitely make the first. But the first is conditioned on the quality of what happened, right? My point is simply that rarity doesn't really prevent you, or it's not really authorize you to give an exterior qualification on small processes which you decided not to engage yourself.
Gabriel, I think that speaks precisely to the question of how does he know that a certain historical mode is saturated? And I think that this is where I'm still stuck between the relationship between politics and history for him. Because how can you make any kind of claim about historical modes without a historical investigation?
Yeah, my opinion on that, I don't know. You guys, I think you've seen that. I think that this book is a book about leftist pragmatism, right? For organizers, that's what I take from it. And I think that for me, saturation is the epitome of that. Like, there's a very easy way to find out if something is saturated. You try it and it doesn't work. Like, you don't need a historical analysis. Like, try to use Jacobin language in Rio. It doesn't work. Like, you cannot do politics with it. That's when it's amazing, because I find it crazy that in, I don't know how many 100 years of revolutionary political thinking, most of our concepts to talk about failure are about deviations, never about exhaustion. And this might be the only concept I know of which says, okay, this doesn't work anymore. Like, it's not saying somebody is immoral, somebody is using it for bad. It literally you might no longer refer to the things you wanted to refer. Like,
so Gabriel, that's the concept of saturation for me is what Althusser called the crisis in Marxism, right?
Mm-hmm.
The very moment in 1977 where he says we've been in crisis since the 40s,
yeah.
But now we can declare it. And I think that this is where I think for Lazarus, I think that he's grabbing that concept and saying that's saturation. The Bolshevik Party is saturated. That entire sort of mode of thought is done. Historical mode is done, and now we need something else.
Yeah, but I think just to conclude, sorry guys, I think I interrupted somebody. But I think that you don't need to bring this question to a meta level. You can bring it further in. Like, this is what it means, let's say, to oh my God, like, empower situated inquiries. It means that the resources you have in a situation are enough to make a balance sheet of past political history. Like, it's not gonna, let's say, undo the victories of past politics, but it's gonna give you a concrete measure of what still refers to something and what no longer refers, right? And it's not again, because it's not a one intellectuality, there is no one intellectuality, that saturation will be tied to that particular intellectuality. Right? So let's say my solution for this problem would be to move further in. Like, when it becomes a political declaration of saturation of a political language, you don't worry about if this is valid. Perhaps in other places, this is not the case. I think perhaps, I don't know, in Brazil, you can see this. In Rio de Janeiro, if you use socialist terms, because we have absolutely no history of socialist governments in Rio, it doesn't work. In São Paulo, it works. Like, it has a kind of weight, like it touches on something.
Mm-hmm.
And I can talk about it being saturated in a context and not saturated in another, rather than making this bombastic general statement about it no longer being the case. And I think that I totally agree that the best example we have of this being operated anywhere is Althusser, who, I mean, if somebody tried for a very long time to reorganize the categories of Marxism so that not every mistake we make is because somebody is morally wrong, right? But because we don't have the right tools, because we no longer, words are no longer concepts, right? It was him, but at the same time, it's very ambiguous, as Lazarus says himself. If he made this to politicize philosophy or to introduce this method back into politics, right? It's an ambivalent position. Though I think it's a bit less ambivalent than he says. Sometimes everyone was so mean to Althusser. Sometimes I don't think it's necessary.
I just wanted, it is 6 p.m. So for those that have to bounce, feel free to do so. If it's okay, I think, Gabriel, can we continue a little longer?
Sure. No,
Okay.
I'm okay. I can be a bit more, I can lower the resolution to 8 bits in the reconstruction also so
Well,
we
I
can
think-
actually cover more.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, we're at the body of this work, and I think maybe if we could sort of pick up next time, literally at this sequence we're at, or at this point that we're at in the text, it'd be useful. And then maybe we can finish more as well. But I don't think we need to rush to thinking after classism, the next chapter.
Okay, no, it's up to you guys.
Maybe we can kind of postpone it to next week. And, that will set us back a bit, but it would be better than us being very rushed,
Mhm.
You guys agree? Sort of work through these things?
Yeah.
Good. So if anybody has to leave, but they want to say something before they go, let's have a moment where people can kind of just speak freely, comment.
Okay. Yeah, I have to dip, but I think Alex had a point that I think might be relevant. Like, I'm personally also just trying to connect the reiteration discussion to the historical modes of politics conversation. And there was like just this entire section on page 65 was really interesting to me. I mean, I kind of read it in a particular way, and I wish I could say around to talk about it with y'all, but I do think there's something here, like, in some sense, it seems to be that he's saying that reiteration is what makes the distinction between the two statements make sense. And so if you have like, and he talks about it in terms of like a gap or a break. And so here's my, like, I try to rewrite it, and it was something like, if there's a gap between politics and the thought of politics, the anthropology of the name is kind of interested in interrogating the thought of different intellectualities of politics, or different, or maybe that's not right, but like different thoughts of politics. And I kind of, maybe I'll stay around for like 2 more minutes, but I just kind of wanted to know what y'all thought about that.
Because we haven't talked about time, and we haven't talked about
You mean in the book or about in the
Lazarus's
Okay.
sort of theory of time, because I think it's important, because he has this point. He says right before he introduces repeatability and reiteration, he says there is a subjective category of time which, once entered, it's kind of like a collective theory of interiority's relationship to time, where the possible is now open, or what will come is open. And I think this kind of links back to the notion of the rarity piece, because people enter into that space frequently, yet novelty within that space is rare, is how I would say it. So like, there is a certain temporality which groups enter frequently, but they're not organized in that space adequate for something there to be produced that would shift a mode, for example. That's how I read it.
I kind of wanted to take a stab at Taylor's question, or like kind of link Jerome's question back to Taylor's question, because like, I think there's 2 parts of the problem of like of people thinking and that sort of engaged inquiry process, and the notion of, and the notion that we brought up of the crisis of Marxism, of this sort of saturated character of Marxism-Leninism, and the kind of end of the Stalinist sequence, right? It seems like these are 2 sort of parts of one problem, where on the one hand, the question is like, how do we think what has been thought in socialist movements in particular historical conjunctures, right? How do we not like refer to Marx and like take some terminology from Marx and apply it to a situation, but like do the kind of thinking that Marx was engaged in, or do the kind of thinking, situated thinking that Lenin had engaged in, without simply like taking those as being like repeatable like conditions, right? And I think that there's like a major tendency to be like, okay, this is how the October Revolution happened, therefore like we need to organize in this way, therefore like we're waiting for such and such conditions to emerge, and like that's never going to happen because historical events are singular, right? But then the question becomes like, how do we think these lapsed categories, right? Because like the meaning, you know, if we refer to ourselves as communists, right, this doesn't mean the same thing as it meant when Althusser or Lazarus or somebody refers to themselves as, you know, we communists, right? And the other side of it being sort of the kind of Maoist side of attempting to like actually just of practicing a kind of mass line of engaging in the thought that people have in order to understand their situation as a militant, right? Which I think sometimes gets inflected in such a way as to sort of reproduce the idea that like theory comes from outside and enters the, you know, the consciousness of the proletariat, rather than like this imminent process of inquiry, engagement, and constructing a subject. Sorry, that was a long remark, but
I think I want to pick up on something, on some of the points you're making. I think I'm in agreement with. I think, Gabriel, that the method of saturation can't be understood as a pragmatist point, because I think that the other aspect of this statement about the rarity of politics is that politics is sequential, meaning it has a beginning and an end. And if we are to identify a historical mode of politics, it means that we identify a sequence which has ended. So there's no sense in which we could take the categories of a sequence which has ended and then experiment with them today. Or this would be a totally different way of framing the question than I think is the one that Lazarus had. So the method of saturation, I think, is not actually a theory of why a particular mode comes to an end. That is simply given. That mode has ended. The method of saturation allows us to think what was thought in that mode. It allows us to say there was thought there. So it allows us to say that the Leninist insight was not one which we can evaluate from some invariant historical standpoint or from some transhistorical standpoint and say, these are the good things and these are the bad things about parties. The method of saturation allows us to say that there was a particular form of thought there which ended, but which had its own meaning within its given situation. That's my interpretation.
I see. No, it actually makes a lot of sense. And I think that it also corrects something that I'm definitely guilty of, which is not respecting so clearly the space of anthropology of the name and politics, which is something that it's a personal thing. I find the anthropology of the name as a position, which is a sort of very intimate process of circulating between political processes, talking about different sequences at the same time that it respects their own intelligibility and actually political practice, right? I think that sometimes I mix the two too much, and that's the sort of problem that appears, which is a method that is developed for, let's say, generally talking about different politics, which I think is where he's worried with. He's more worried with constructing a methodology for truly speaking about political thinking in their singularities, right? So ultimately, it is an intellectual kind of, very much like an anthropology. Like you want to be able to inhabit or to know different processes and respect or extract or be intimate with what's singular about them. And I think that to bring this into, let's say, what it is useful politically can very well just remove precisely the place of where his contribution is, which I think is exactly what you're pointing to with regards to, let's say, developing categories that then help you to talk rationally about the different historical modes. That's where saturation is coming in, etc. Yeah, no, I agree. It's definitely a bit of a push towards, as I said, where I've ever used this stuff. The only place where I ever had use for it is coming up with a way of talking about, let's say, failure in a political debate, which you don't really explain through deviations, opportunisms, and so on. The fact that words no longer refer to what we thought they referred, or that certain concepts no longer are working as concepts, so no thought is going through those words, seems useful, but I agree with you, it's actually a very kind of derivative deformation of the actual content. Perhaps that distinction should be made, yeah. And I think it goes back also to the question of end of sequences, breaks, and it organizes the categories better. So I think you're much more right than I am on that.
Well, there seems to be too, again, like just to relate something maybe to a sort of basic text that I'd have like some familiarity with, but like 18th Brumaire, you know, Marx talks in the beginning of that about, the weight of the dead generations weigh like a nightmare, the problem of trying to go back and find the old languages and the old symbols and the old costumes and everything. And he talks about this kind of issue of having to try to translate it into the native tongue or the mother tongue, but that, things only start working as soon as you have forgotten that tongue and you've actually entered into a new kind of, situation. This seems to me a lot like kind of what Lazarus is talking about, except he's using this to attack Marx, essentially, or Marxism or Marxist-Leninism in some way, or not attack, but just critique or to point out that this is itself saturated in some way. I don't know if that's the correct reading, but that's one way I'm just trying to think of how this relates to something that I would have some familiarity with.
Line there, just another line from the 18th Brumaire I was thinking as you were just talking. His somewhat puckish reframing of Hegel's line that history repeats itself, yes, but first is tragedy and then is farce. Well, in that text, we have a nice little reiteration, but he's not saying what comes after the farce. And perhaps we are at the end of where Marx's own conceptions of reiteration has been helpful. Just another little footnote.
You see, I take it as like a certain form of subjective thinking, which is the origin of thought, and which is posing a break at the level of time. In other words, it constitutes a shift in the operability of some fragment of the proletariat or some fragment of a group or a series of groups that are able to sustain a reiterative process to the generation of their own efficacious relationship to emancipation. You see what I mean? So there's a kind of a doubling. So it begins with when you ask the question, what is consciousness conscious of, or what is significant? So if you are interested in a type of representational justice, you still have interiority there if that group can ask this meta level question that would be the glue or the kind of point which would tether their activity, which is they sort of, and so that becomes the beginning point, and that beginning point is where a possible novelty is presented, a new possible is open, is how I look at it. And then there are these questions of saturation as well, which almost seem epistemological endpoints for that group in some sense, to place themselves within the past dead histories, you know? I also realized that we only got through one chapter today because we're kind of at the end. So maybe that's actually 2 hours per chapter, which is not great news for finishing the book in time, but it is what it is.
I also wonder, with regard to questions about time involved in this too, if maybe if visiting Laplanche's work around Nachtraglichkeit and his further pushing of the envelope of afterwardness might factor into this nicely. I'm thinking too of this method of saturation. In a certain sense, I mean, it does kind of smack loudly of Hegelian sublation, where you have, in a certain sense, you approach this sort of lapsing of a mode and the historicity falls out, but then you pick the historicity back up into intellectuality, and then what do we arrive at? A certain kind of Nachtraglichkeit where all of a sudden, right, the form of singularity is allowed a certain aspect or vista conceptually to revise the conditions of historicity by using the very historicity that fell out of that lapsing of the mode. And I'd wager that Laplanche might have some valuable inroads into thinking this aspect that could also delay our
But he's not committed, and he says so pretty specifically, and I think this differentiates him from Lacan, from psychoanalysis, that that theory of the subject is repeatability.
Sure.
Whereas his is reiteration. So there is a certain thing with him and Badiou where there is a kind of hold on, like a cut in repetition. You see my point?
I do, and I wonder if
psychoanalysis is not committed to that.
Yeah, unless we maybe invoke like Jameson's idea of non-mimetic repetitions, which in a certain sense, I don't know, is that something similar to, you know, with like Todd McGowan's idea of repetition is always repetition of an original failure. So there's never actually a repetition qua repetition, but there's always a sort of introduction or intervention of the possible in that non-mimetic repetition. Insofar as you have that sort of Nachtraglichkeit form working in its singularity, dealing with the historicity that has fallen out, taken back up in intellectuality as a sort of looking backwards to.
Yeah, I want to invite Gabriel to comment on this, because I know you have like a lot of unique insights here.
Well, my unique insights are that I had a really hard time making that sort of connection. I mean, I'm Lacanian. All I wanted in life was that Lacan would explain everything, and so I wouldn't have to study anything else. So I deeply kind of have a lot of solidarity with trying to make these connections, because I've tried them for long. But ultimately, I would say that it's actually the opposite way. I think you can understand repetition in psychoanalysis better if you start from Lazarus than understand Lazarus starting from Lacan. For example, let me give you a example and make some free merch for myself, because I'm writing about this currently. Nobody really understands what the hell Lacan means by real repetition and all these things, and we want to ask questions about, okay, if there's repetition, shouldn't it be scientific? So what is the difference, and all those sort of things. And it's funny because I think Lazarus' framework is broader than Lacan's, strangely enough, because Lazarus accepts one thing that I think both Badiou and he consider that Lacan does not, which is that intellectualities begin. It's funny that the most clinical of all psychoanalysts, which I think Lacan was deeply concerned with the clinic, never really worried about how does the clinic begin. Transference is not the beginning of psychoanalysis. I mean, if you practice psychoanalysis begins shutting the door and letting people talk. That's not transference. There's no concept for how an analysis begins, which is a crazy thing. But you can derive most of Lacan's complex concepts from that very fact. I mean, the idiotic fact that when you close the door of the clinic, you no longer have the means to know if what people say is true or not. That's the reason why the real is such a complicated concept. It's simply as that. You don't have access to the outside world. You have only access to speech. So the only things that resist are the things that go wrong with speech. So there is a totally materialist, simple genesis for the relation between repetition and real in psychoanalysis, which has no kind of metaphysical complexity to it. The crazy thing is that that's exactly what Lazarus is saying. Like, real comes after interiority, not before. You don't explain the interiority via the real, you explain the real via interiority. And the funny thing is that suddenly, with this stupid, simple shit, the concept of real in psychoanalysis becomes much more simple. Look, if you close the door and people are speaking and you have no access to the reporting function of speech, you can't really know anything that speech refers to other than itself, right? A statement can only refer to what? To another statement, because it cannot be referring to the outer world. I don't know if my patients lie or not. I don't care. I know that they say something, and then in the second moment, they are embarrassed and trying to tell me that that's not what they meant. The real is, they're speaking in a relation of the real. They're not speaking about the outside. So Lazarus explains the concept of real in Lacan, not in verse, because he actually thinks that there is such a thing as an interiority, and that real is a relative concept to an interiority. You don't get that in Lacan. In Lacan, the real is a concept that has a whole ontogenetic claim. So I think that's the first point. The second point is that this suddenly makes psychoanalysis, politics, compatible with science, because science experiments are artificial spaces decoupled from a lot of interferences, within which, rather than reality, you get some bit of regularity, which you can actually trust to be, let's say, information about a phenomenon, because some interferences are left out. So suddenly, all these complicated ideas, very metaphysical, profound things, start to become very simple, simply because you introduced the idea that the real is relative to an interior that has some sort of axiomatic border, right? So I think that we get tangled up a lot if we try to do the inverse, because there are a lot of presuppositions in Lacanian theory of language to bypass the problem that language only works the way that Lacan says within the clinic. So to say that language works that way everywhere, that's how we get entangled in, okay, how do I explain Nachträglichkeit when I'm talking to my grandma at home? How do I explain enjoyment? It doesn't work so quickly. Yeah. But in the clinic, just by assuming interiority, that the clinic is an interior, all those things become very much more clear. So I think that the Lazarus can actually help us to understand Lacan in that point, you know? By relativizing, it's weird. I mean, it's not what I wanted to happen, because of course, I want to use the things that I studied to understand other stuff. But in this case, I had to accept defeat.
I was wondering, we kind of addressed the origin of thought, but then he says that once you have thought, and then thought becomes the first of what he calls a simple name. And I thought that was a really important point on this notion of the originary name. Like, in other words, it's something like the generation of that simple name allows us to name. Like, it's kind of our training wheels.
I couldn't help but
Please, go ahead.
Touching on that subject of possibly again making sense of this through Lacan, the moment he brought up Nachträglichkeit or après coup, immediately, of course, I think of the graph of desire. And when I think of the graph of desire, of course, I think of, I think it's first Laclau and Mouffe who use it to map ideology. And then Zizek famously does it in his first volume. And I can't help but wonder, and also in connection here with like a primitive naming act, whether, I don't know, I can't help but think that that same procedure might illuminate something about the method of saturation here, where, you know, you have this kind of quoting point that just becomes oversaturated at a certain point. It can't continue quoting a certain field.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, just to continue on the point that Frank raised, and I think that you developed further now. I think there's a very good and nice reason why he calls these things simple names and not primitive names or originary names, because and I also think that we should really, I mean, that's my impression, that if there's something to stress out of the stress in this chapter that we shouldn't really let go, is this kind of exercise of not connecting things back to their condition, ontological conditions, but connecting things back to their consequence. So names are not originary. That's too much a qualification. They're simple because you cannot qualify them further. So it's rather than giving them an extreme difference, which is very Lacanian, sort of baptism, sort of primal name, name of the father, things like this. Your first step in this method is always to give a sort of indistinct qualification, because the determinations comes after. And that's a very important distinction between, for example, the reason why Lacanians love talking about the law and Badiouians like to talk about axioms. To know a law has a very weird dialectic with what is outside of it, right? When you delimit what is lawful, you also need to delimit what is outside of the law. And we love to point that out and show how something exterior is inside. You name the crime as you name the law. But axioms are not like that. Nobody chooses an axiom based on its relation to the outside. You choose an axiom based on what it does. And to know what it does, you need to follow through with it. It might not be as good as you thought, and you change it. Even if you have like your own private, like ZFC Axiomatic can be understood by all the political messiness of mathematics resenting each other and wanting to do something better than each other. But if they work or don't work, depends on the consequences that follow from them. So axiomatic thinking, I think prescriptive thinking, and I think Lazarus' approach to intellectuality, interiority, and the modes I think the first qualification is always indeterminate, simple. To say it's primitive is already to say too much. It's just simple, like you're naming a certain region. You need to go inside of it to determine it. The first naming doesn't give you, let's say, a hidden determination. Oh, I say all men need to be brother. But in between the lines, I'm already saying that people who are not brothers are not even men. You know, like Lacanian analysis of law. It's not, the law is not a model for prescriptions. It's not a model for interiority. It doesn't carry the exterior inside of it in a hidden compartment. It's really like simple, like it's a simple name, like it doesn't say much, but I think that's more the way these things operate, you know? That's why the Lacanian approach, I think, sometimes makes things more obscure, because Lacan is committed to the idea that language is the only thing with no exterior. So to talk about a name is to talk about primitive names, the originary stuff. I don't think Lazarus has that. On the contrary, I think he's taking a lot of work to remove us from that sort of approach to language, to names, to words, you know? Like, I think Drew said, like, Brazil, you don't know what Brazil means. It's just that thing there, it's simple. Like, the question is what comes after that. It's not about the presuppositions when he named it Brazil. Is he, in fact, claiming something about, you know, I don't care, it's not about that. So it's really hard, I think, for us to accept this theory of language that is at stake in Lazarus' idea. Like words, names, all of this is much more defined by what follows than by what conditions, right? It's strange procedure. And I think that really delimits, let's say, the contribution of this chapter, right? It's a really complicated exercise, both rhetorically, both in trying to tell us how to read it with the discussion of iteration and reiteration. Sorry, Drew, you were saying something.
Yeah, and Gabriel, I mean, that goes to his critique fundamentally of Foucault, right? In the, I think it's the next chapter when he talks about the order of things. His basic critique of Foucault is that Foucault is really great at thinking synchrony, but that he's not able to think a diachronic. And basically what he's trying to argue is that through the use of the sequentiality of names, he's able to introduce, resolve that problem in structuralist analysis of synchrony versus diachrony. And like, that's where he's really with this problem, because if he doesn't have, because he can easily fall back into that problem. And that's why he needs the anthropology to work for him.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
For him, the problem of diachrony is always the one of, if you're going to say a mode is saturated, then what is the next mode and how does it basically erupt, right? And so this is and then you're stuck with this operation of its relation to the real, off the real.
Let's see if there's any questions. No, I think most of the questions that I separated, that I took from the notes, we kind of addressed one way or another. But yeah, no, I really think that this point is worth stressing. I think the Foucault reference is really good because it's always this, I find him always trying to struggle, kind of to keep a balance away from these two poles, right? You get a, let's say, structuralism will bring into the table a sort of thinking of an acceptance that something is going on in social processes that is more than just how it presents itself. But it doesn't give you the historical sequentiality and the interior, let's say, it doesn't allow this singularity to constitute, let's say, a world for itself, right? It doesn't really explain why in a certain process people suddenly reorganize their intrusion in a calendar. They belong to a certain sequence of other names rather than others. They refer to this rather than that. All of this gets kind of blurred in this. And I think that this kind of structure versus historical, where structural gives a bit of singularity, historical gives a bit of multiplicity, but you never get both. And this also exterior kind of social approach versus, which is more transcendental, so to speak, versus this sort of relative regional version. I think those are the two axes that he's really struggling never to fall into any of them, right? It's very complicated to keep there. How in a synchronous sense you recognize singularity and you can be so intimate with a process, but at the same time, how can you do this without erasing the fact that this is a sequence with a beginning and an end that saturates and doesn't gain this sort of uniqueness, right? No, man, Drew, thank you so much. You helped me a lot with this as well. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, we're not moving to.
Well, I think that you have created a presentation on what is probably the densest chapter of Thinking After Classism. Let's pick it up next time on that. The next chapter is about really his theory of time. It's called Unnameable Names. I don't think that realistically we'll be able to get to that next time, although we do need to discuss it before our big kind of plenary on the 30th. So I'm trying to think about how to manage that. I also want to throw something on the table, which is that the colleague or the comrade of Lazarus, Claire, says that he may be available mid-June. So if you all have the kind of stamina to extend our plenary to mid-June, where Lazarus is more likely to be able to give a speech to us, maybe we should do that so that on the 30th we can like properly finish the book, and that the 30th kind of be spent concluding the book. That's just an idea. I know it's hard to gauge this like right now, but
yeah, I think there are too few people here.
There's too few people. I'm just thinking out loud. It's kind of one thought, which I'll pose maybe in a poll, like on like a survey poll or something through Slack. But that's what I'm thinking right now, Gabriel, is that we would sort of, if you're up for it, if you're free next Saturday.
Yeah, I need to check that. I can share the material. I produce like this sort of summaries or selections from the next chapter as well. In case I'm not available, I can definitely share it with you guys. You can use it, but I need to check if I'm available.
Sure.
Not
okay.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Very good. Are there any other questions or sort of burning comments before we conclude? I think Aaron Audubon, maybe, did you have something? I saw you kind of unmute.
Oh, no, but I just should say thank you to the various facilitators today. That's all.
Okay, okay.
The one thing that I wrote down here that we didn't comment on was, I forgot the guy's name, but he asked about the critique of Marx and classism and how this plays into the book and the argument. I'm not sure if we should go into this. But also there was a question that connects with this, I think, which was on the notes concerning what exactly, let's say, you could very broadly place Lazarus and Badiou as well in this sort of project of, I mean, I don't think it's fair to say this, but kind of what we usually call the autonomy of the political, right? Because in a certain sense, this is also the autonomy of the political in the sense of autonomy from the idea of the political. So I don't think they would fit together very well with other thinkers we might assume to represent this line. But there are all these questions that are raised more about Badiou than Lazarus, I think, on, let's say, the way that a certain heritage of Marxist thinking concerned political economy, the role of political economy in their writings on politics, why it has this different place. If this different place is, let's say, a demotion of its importance, it's no longer relevant because it's, let's say, delegitimated as a knowledge, or if it is, let's say, simply a shift in the place and how it's brought into political thinking, right? For example, I tend to think that it's hard. It's an interesting problem because I think it's hard to place these guys into a tradition of the sort of autonomy of the political, where politics is the sort of practice that concerns the empty seat of power, wherever you want to approach this idea that distinguishes it from economical practices and things like this. I don't think they really fit this place, but also it's clear that they do have a stake on the debate on where does political economy come into political thinking, right? So I think that this is usually one of the things it's more counterintuitive, and people love to write, for example, with regards to Badiou, as if there is he substitutes political economy, the critique of political economy, for something else, or that he delegitimizes its value within strategic political thinking and things like this. So I think that also gives rise to perhaps we can have a more informed debate on this based on the way that these categories are being presented here. Because, for example, my impression is that as an anthropologist of the name, somebody who is trying to allow for this distinction, you actually have a way out of this to answer it, which would be to say, the critique of political economy is not the general frame of reference of all politics, meaning it's that exterior which allows me to understand in a sort of a priori way what politics is thinking in its different presentations, in its different situations. But insofar as the situations and processes are entangled with the different presentations of contemporary society, it's part of their reference to address political economy one way or another, and they might mobilize these words as concepts or not. So it's not so much a matter of, let's say, disinvesting political thinking from its economic, political economy, critique of political economy, so much as not allowing that fact or the ubiquity of economic matters to making visible that each different frame of reference will have to make do with that question in its own way, right? I'm not sure if that makes any sense.
It's a really nice point that he takes up on pages 76 and 77, where he addresses this precise point of what in his notion of the functional state and the relationship between state and economy. And I like it because it's a sort of advancement from the earlier presentation he gives us on this notion of statism, and in his critique, which you all remember of from our first session, of the ideologism of the sequence of Leninism in saturation, where Leninism only went about to, in its orthodox instantiations and even in its heterodox instantiations, somehow to reaffirm statism. And then by this next chapter, Thinking After Classism, he really shows how he kind of distinguishes these categories. So I'm really excited for next time to unpack what is probably, you know, the most important chapter, really, where everything kind of congeals, if you like.
Yeah, I agree.
You know, of the book, right?
Yeah, I think that this discussion on the critique of Marx, classism, and the whole point about how do these guys with this particular political orientation or approach, how do they deal with political economy and the critique of political economy in Marx? I think that he makes a very good point when he discusses those two dialectical approaches, right? The dialectics of the subjective and the objective versus the dialectic of the objective and the subjective. Because I think that Zizek makes a interesting remark in Parallax View that never developed further, but I think that he gives, Lazarus gives a much more clear kind of conceptual structure to the problem, which is what Zizek calls the Marxian parallax, which is either you emphasize class struggle or value theory, usually as a Marxist theorist. Like either you reduce class struggle to an effect of the form of value, or you downplay the autonomy of the value form in order to give prevalence to class struggle. So you don't get to the same point if you begin from the dialectics of the subjective and the objective. You kind of end up with a weakened value form theory, or you end up with a weakened form of political theory of class struggle if you start from value form. Like somehow these two things they don't allow you to construct this sort of identity, conceptual identity between the, let's say, mapping of a political situation and the construction of a strategic approach to it, right? So I don't know, I found it a very interesting kind of touching point between very different approaches to a sort of critique of how Marxism developed, right? So yeah, I think that's a good topic for the next chapter.
I love all of this stuff too on the this thesis of reversibility and Lenin's polemics with the German Social Democrats around partial reversibility and full reversibility. And you really see Lazarus's reworking of the dialectic in the next chapter. And it becomes very apparent what he's talking about, I think, in relationship to the long tradition of Marxist reflections on the dialectic, you know? So, man, I hope you can come next time, Gabriel, because
no, I'd love really to. Great. I really want to, yeah.
Yeah, all the best, everybody. We will conclude for today. I'll take the reins and close it down. And cheers, everybody. Have a wonderful Saturday night. And Gabriel, thank you, man. Really.
It was a pleasure. I feel like I understand the book a bit better now.
Absolutely. Hopefully you can come back.
Yeah, hopefully, yeah.